Before I start, I want to tell you a brief anecdote, which I think is highly relevant in a strange sort of way to what I want to say in general. When I was oh, by the way, has anybody in this room play a clarinet? Well, however many of you who play the clarinet, let me just tell you that you, in spite of what Victoria's told you, I am by far the worst clarinet player than you are, and everybody else in the room. I'm terrible. The only thing that I'm probably even equally bad at is the saxophone. And my problem with the clarinet is that basically the director of the Royal College of Music is a rather distinguished clarinetist. So part of the Faustian pact was that if I was prepared to chair the Royal College, then I would have to learn the clarinet with him as my teacher. It's been a very arduous process. When I was a medical student, there was a study done in South Wales in mining communities, looking at general practitioners in 3 groups. There was a time when a drug had just come out which was clearly likely to be suitable for people with chronic chest problems, particularly cough, very common in South Wales with the mining areas. It could have been used, of course, not far from where we're sitting today, but this is where this drug company chose to trial this drug. And they tried the drug on 3 different group practices. Group practices were not so common in the 50s, but that's what they used deliberately. So there were a group of doctors in the first practice who really believed in the drug, who thought this was a great improvement on what they had in their therapeutic armamentarium. The second group were agnostic, weren't sure whether it was a good drug or not. And the third group, who were prescribing this drug, were atheists. They believed it was a completely useless drug. The patients were studied over 6 months. Around 2,000 patients were studied in all, quite a large study. And then at the end of the study, after 6 months, these patients were then assessed by an independent panel of doctors on a blind basis. That is to say, they didn't know which doctor had seen them in the previous treatment cycle. People who went to a doctor who really believed in the drug had around a 78% improvement in their symptoms. The people who went to the doctors who were agnostic had around a 45% improvement in their symptoms. And the people who did not believe in the drug at all, those doctors, they got something like an 18% improvement in their symptoms. Now, I'm going to leave that story just where it is, because I want to say something which will be uncomfortable to you. I mean, I thought about this very carefully, and I don't want in any way to decry the wonderful work that the Lost Chord's doing, or the sort of research that's going on in this area, which I believe is very important. But I want to try and throw some kind of focus on this. It seems to me that, above all, we, I think, have to, as scientists, think like musicians, and I think musicians will have to think like scientists. We speak a different language, and the language is very different. I do quite a lot of educational research, but I'm not an educationalist. And the research I'm doing is quite foreign to me, and I found it extraordinarily difficult to manage the PhD students who are under my supervision doing what is essentially social science. And in fact, I think that if I had been a social scientist, they would be doing much better work than with me used to non-parametric statistics and statistics associated with cause and effect in a biological setting. I work essentially in a laboratory, although of course I have worked with patients as well. My fundamental training is laboratory training. Now, having said that, let me try and explain where I'm coming from. It's, I think, very clear from a number of publications, and I don't take this as anything other than as read, that music clearly has an influence on processing in the brain, because in fact they're often processed in rather similar ways. We can see that from a number of studies that it improves encoding of linguistics. And as I'll show you in a second, even with 8 weeks training, you can make quite a difference in how the brain perceives things. I'm going to talk a little bit about speech, because obviously one of the issues when dealing with so many of the concerns that we have with patients who are needing therapy, the key issue, of course, is communication. We are essentially, ladies and gentlemen, a unique species, partly, indeed very largely, because of the way and the unique nature of our communication. In fact, we communicate in a way that no other animal species does at an extraordinarily high level. And I think there is a lot of evidence to show that, and we depend on that communication. And indeed, there are many neuroscientists and paleoscientists who believe that actually one of the key three things which happened in human evolution was the development of communication, probably as a result of being hunters, and probably as a result of being extremely vulnerable when we were on the savannah with very, very poor motor skills, very poor weapons, inability to defend ourselves, and therefore communication within the human group, or the human group, was very important. In fact, music and language are very, very closely linked, and indeed the areas in the brain are, certainly if you're right-handed, probably in the left hemisphere around Broca's area, which is the speech area of the brain. So we're looking at something which is indistinguishable, really, in terms of our communication ability. That's possibly one of the reasons why music is so important to us. There are, of course, unquestionable, and I could cite so many publications, but one of the things I want to suggest to you is, I've got my slides, of course, out of order, as I always manage to do. Never mind, this will do perfectly well. Is to point out that in neuroscience now, we have, I think I must be about the most disorganized lecturer. I gave a lecture in the University of Southern California this week, and I think that they didn't understand a word of what I was saying. And I'm not sure entirely it was my language. There we are. But then, their sort of laboratory is very different from mine. I want to say something to you that one of the reasons why the field that we're discussing this evening is so important is because neuroscience is really coming of age. It's still not come of age, actually, but we now have a whole range of tools to look at central nervous function in a way that was highly impossible before. Of course, we can look at electrical activity in the brain. That's certainly done with music, using a magic hairnet, lots of electrodes on the scalp, but it's pretty inaccurate, and it doesn't give you the kind of discrimination, for example, that you can get with other techniques. MRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is now really almost a key tool in neuroscience, but I believe we're going to go much beyond that. In the last 2 months, there have been a couple of publications, for example, looking at how we can record from neurons which have been dosed with magnetically alterable nanoparticles. Now, we can't do that in the human for obvious reasons, but we can start now to look at how magnetism changes when certain neurons are activated over the brain, just as previously we're starting to look at optogenetics, where we can look at laser lights inside individual neurons in the brain. And what we're beginning to be able to do now is to do extraordinarily sophisticated measurement inside the cortex and inside actually other parts of the brain as well. So it's quite relevant to look here at Adrian Owen's work. Adrian Owen was at Cambridge when I first met him. He's now working at McGill University in Canada. And here is something which I think is really important to us, and it's really important to people who are dealing with patients with dementia, for example. So what we can see here in these 4 images, these individuals here are healthy volunteers. These individuals here have got very severe brain damage. You can see that there's a massive part of the skull missing, and there's damage to the temporal frontal cortex, some of the motor areas as well. These 2 brains here are people who are completely immobilized. Indeed, they are not quite in coma, but they have no speech, no ability to respond to commands, and they've been like that since the accident. And in Adrian Owen's case, he's been looking at people who've been perhaps a year and a half in this vegetative state. And it's been generally thought that people in a vegetative state are completely incapable of understanding what is going on around them. What Adrian Owen showed rather remarkably, and he's been able to reproduce this in volunteers, and indeed I was able to do this in his lab in Cambridge to my own satisfaction some years ago when I first met him, was that he was able to elicit responses in the cortex by asking them particular questions. So, for example, one of the tricks that we did together was that I did not see the subject on the table in the MRI machine room, but asked over a speaker a number of questions. So I would get, obviously the brain can't answer yes or no, but it can answer in patterns of its activity. So what this brain is doing here, these two brains are saying, if the answer to the question that I'm asking you is yes, imagine playing tennis. If the answer is no to the question that I'm asking you, don't imagine playing tennis. So what you see here is the motor cortex activated as a result of my asking, in this case, this man, are you over 34? So he's imagining playing tennis because he can't answer yes, he can't answer no. Now, of course, we can elicit exactly the same response in some people who were thought to be pretty well brain dead. They're not brain dead, of course, but there you can see exactly the same response. Now, this doesn't happen in all people in a vegetative response, in a vegetative state, but we can see changes in this blood flow, activation of these parts of the brain, and of course, here we're seeing parts of the brain which are associated with spatial awareness. And in this case, the question is, if the answer to my question is yes, imagine that you are in the kitchen. If the answer is no, don't imagine. And of course, you can see negative as well as positive blood flow. You have to wait a few seconds for that to happen, and then you take the photograph. Now, this work has to be done with exquisite statistical evaluation, and indeed, one of the problems with it is whether or not we're not, even in this situation, eliciting a response which is something we want to see rather than one that is actually happening. And that's a very real issue for all the things that we've been discussing this evening. Nonetheless, I think there is clear evidence here that even in people who have a very damaged brain, who can't communicate in a normal sort of way, certainly one of the last things they're losing is hearing. That, I think, is clearly a given from these experiments. And secondly, most interestingly, they can show more than one layer of thought processes, because we're not just asking them to say yes or no, we're asking, as a result of listening to that question, a further requirement of their brain to develop a next layer, a next tier up. And the evidence is that you may be able to go to 3 or 4 tiers, which are about as far as we can go with the intact brain anyway. So that's very, very striking. Now, the other thing which follows from this, and I think it's quite important, is the understanding that one of the very last perceptions that we lose is our sense of hearing. That is really important, ladies and gentlemen, for all of us to remember, because all of us at some time in our lives will deal with an elderly relative, possibly a parent, who is dying, and it's very easy to talk about them when they're in bed and apparently unconscious. Let me tell you that they may well be able to hear you. I've seen this during anesthesia. I remember once horsing around during an operation with my assistant, saying, "My goodness, you've just caused the most monumental hemorrhage. You fool. And what are you going to do? This is a dire emergency." And role-playing, which is one does sometimes when you're bored with the operation. And afterwards, I went to see the woman, and she said, "You gave me a terrible fright." And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I thought that I was in the middle of an emergency. I thought I was dying from," "What do you mean?" "From hemorrhage." I said, "Don't be silly," because it was always, and didn't remember. She said, "Yeah." She said, you'd cut the left X artery. I mean, she even described it. She didn't know any anatomy. And of course, she'd heard every word of what we'd been saying under anesthesia and recorded it and remembered it. So one of the things that we have to understand is that, this strange business of awareness is very, very complex. when my mother was dying, at the age of 95, she had been in coma and unresponsive for about 3 weeks. She'd take fluids from her mouth, that was it. And I got a little CD machine and played her Mozart. And she woke up, and she became responsive and spoke. Now, the problem, of course, with that observation, is that is entirely anecdotal. It's not scientific evidence. And that's a real issue, I think, for music therapy as well. I mean, it's wonderful to hear the stories that you've been hearing today about the wonderful work that Lost Chord is doing. And it's great to hear what you're doing with people in your field, with people who clearly have brains which are very different from our own. But the real issue is exactly what effect we're having and how that can really be measured. I'm not saying I've got answers to this, I don't, but there are things that we need to be thinking about. So the need for, especially in universities like Sheffield, where there are such high standards of science, we've really got to be absolutely able to demonstrate we have scientific issues, scientific measurement, which is as good as anything that you can do in the laboratory setting. I'm not going to talk about social development. These things are obvious, but of course they are there ready for completeness. I will talk briefly about empathy, because empathy, I think, is relevant, and it's relevant to so much of what's happening in this area of brain science. This is a lovely experiment done by Tanya Singer at University College London. I wish I could quote somewhere something that's come from Imperial College, but there isn't a single experiment here which was done at Imperial, never mind. Tanya Singer is working at the Institute of Neurology, which I think is probably one of the very best neuroscience units in Western Europe. And it challenges probably anything that's being done in the States. What she did here was quite interesting. She put couples in the scanner. Just to make you very much aware, I'm sure you know this already, but the MRI scanner is not an ideal place to measure musical perception because it's extremely noisy, it's very confined, it's not an ideal circumstance, and maybe we should be using other things like PET scanning, positron emission scanning, which is silent. The trouble really is that positron emission scanning uses radioisotopes, and you can only give those to people once. If you do it twice, you probably will fry them. So it's not a very effective way of really getting long-term studies. That's why things like magnetometry and the sort of newer developments which are happening, I think, are going to be increasingly interesting. Having said that, what Tanya did in Ute Frith's group, I think she was in Ute Frith's group at the time, she put lovers in the scanner. So she would give one lover, usually a husband and wife, but not always. I mean, they may have just been cohabiting, I don't know. I can't remember the paper in detail. But knowing most volunteers, by the way, for neuroscience scientists are scientists themselves, because, you know, that's the only way you can pick up volunteers to do this. And if they were scientists, the chances are they were probably cohabiting anyway. So whatever. What was interesting was she would give one half of the partnership an electric shock and demonstrate the activation of neural pathways of perception of pain. The interesting thing, of course, from her wonderful scans is that the partner watching this going on had exactly the same pathways activated in the brain. Very, very good example of empathy. And that happens, I think, probably to some extent in music. Let's just come on to some fairly clear evidence of effect. I think there is no doubt that music therapy has been shown in a variety of really carefully medically controlled situations to be valuable, with undoubted statistical significance to reduce pain, for example, and certainly to reduce anxiety and to increase toleration of the procedure. And that's true too, of course. I think this rather nice meta-analysis is actually a very small set of patients. It's 30 randomized controlled trials in under 2,000 patients, so it's not big, but there seems to be pretty clear evidence that in these patients, music therapy was certainly helpful in reducing pain and improving mood. This is a rather nice example of another aspect of brain function. This Caramia Bien written about 1800, is a very famous aria sung by tenors, and it's with a singer who's being scanned during the moments of silence in the MRI machine. Now, those of you that are really listening really carefully will notice I've transcribed it in C major, but he's not singing in C major. That doesn't matter. Nonetheless, the point I'm making is it's a very, very simple aria, and it's using all sorts of musculature. Now, it turns out that opera singers can actually and do hypertrophy the parts of their brain that they need to use to sing. So they hypertrophy their auditory cortex, some of their motor cortex, some of their temporal cortex, and this has been measured by Kleber in Germany and demonstrated. What's fascinating, though, is that this change in the cortex can be induced in musicians who can't sing at all. They're put in the scanner having trained in that aria, they can read music, and they can pick this up, and after 3 or 4 months, they show the same changes in the brain. And it turns out that what Kleber did after this was to take just students off the street who were not musicians at all, and after several months, he could demonstrate exactly the same changes in the brain. So one of the issues really for us in general is music an inherent quality, or is it something we can all get really rather good at? I'm not going to go down that route today, but it is interesting to consider the genetics of music. Certainly, it's fascinating in the case of Bach, because he's probably the one composer you can think of where it's possible there was a genetic component. He had 20 children, 13 survived, 7 become significant musicians, 6 of them internationally recognized as musicians. But what is interesting in the history of music is that there are very few examples like that. However, some evidence for genetic basis, I think, occurs in some syndromes. William Burns is one example, where there are a large number of genes missing from one chromosome, chromosome 7. And under these circumstances, these children who have extraordinary impairment of cognition often have perfect pitch and pick up music very quickly. And that, I think, is quite interesting, and their brain can show some of those hypertrophies seen in professional musicians. Finally, I want to just have this cautionary tale here. I think Vicky will remember I had this discussion with Dr. Nair in Australia. What Dr. Nair did in a very carefully controlled study, and this is why I think we need to be very much aware of this issue, is he played about 17 different Baroque composers to people who were suffering from dementia in the closed environment of a care home. And he did this in a highly controlled fashion, so they were exposed to these slow movements only, and rather quietly, so the music was never loud to stimulate them too much, and they were exposed to this music in the background for several hours. What he found was that he could control volume, speed, he looked at, of course, only recorded music, and he looked particularly at general behavior, which was independently assessed. What he found was that after exposure to Baroque music, in his study, independently assessed, his demented patients showed more disturbance afterwards. They were more sleepless, more violent, often had poor, greater memory deficiencies, and this was actually statistically significant. Now, the reason why I say this is not to in any way debunk music therapy. It's to point out how careful we have to be in how we measure what we do to human patients. I think it's something which is extraordinarily significant, and perhaps it's just a slight cautionary warning when obviously everything I'm saying is wholly supportive of the notion of doing music. I must tell you, when I give up my chairmanship at the Royal College of Music at the moment, I'm thinking about enrolling for another PhD. It is a degree-awarding institution, and I'm thinking about dealing with some of these issues myself, but from a slightly different slant. I've got 1 or 2 ideas about how one might investigate that. I think that's quite enough said. Probably, I'm sorry, too much. Forgive me.